As we will discuss momentarily, today the conservative movement is at an inflection point on foreign policy. It is not necessarily clear which direction it will take in the future. We are delighted to have you here for our inaugural conversation and hope you will continue to participate in the series. This week, we are pleased to open our series with Dr. Colin Dueck, who is a professor at George Mason University and a fellow with the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. Dueck is an expert on grand strategy and recently wrote a book on the history of conservative foreign policy, Age of Iron, with a focus on conservative nationalism. Today's conversation will help us understand the importance of this period in history and set the stage for the rest of the series. In a moment, I will turn it over to Colin for some opening remarks. We will then have a brief discussion before opening the session for Q&A from the audience. You can submit your questions in the chat box at any point during the discussion. And with that, Colin, we'd like to open with a few remarks from you. Thank you. Yes.
So I'll just start with maybe about 5 minutes describing what the purpose of my book was, Age of Iron. I tried to delineate three main schools of thought among conservatives and Republicans over the last century. My argument was that this has been misunderstood. There tends to be a simplification whereby people sort of label either isolationists on the one hand or warmongers on the other. That's, for example, what I was taught in grad school. But Republicans and conservatives, I think there's a range of points of view, and I identified three main factions over time, and they kind of wax and wane, they come together in different ways over time. The first is conservative non-interventionists, which has an ancient lineage. These are conservatives and Republicans who believe the U.S. should not be engaged in alliances overseas. It shouldn't have military bases. It shouldn't be intervening militarily overseas. That was actually a dominant view for generations. The second view on the other end of the spectrum are conservative internationalists, who I describe as simply conservatives, in other words, people who are conservative on domestic issues, but believe that the U.S. should be active overseas in terms of alliances, bases, free trade agreements, and a range of diplomatic, economic, and military commitments. And then the third group in the middle, and this I think is the group that's often missing in the scholarly analysis and the journalistic analysis and the political analysis, are conservative nationalists, and that's the subtitle of my book. Conservative nationalists can pivot in either direction. They are sort of the key players. They're probably a plurality of the voters among Republicans for generations now, tend to be more likely to be working class, middle class, kind of heartland conservatives. And the view there is it can go in either direction, but there's a strong emphasis on U.S. sovereignty, sticking up for U.S. interests. There's a lot, it's pro-military for sure, but also often wary of new interventions overseas. So my argument is that depending on events and leadership and international conditions, political conditions at home, that these coalitions have come together and reformulated at different times in different ways. So for example, during World War I, there was a heated debate over what exactly to do in response to Woodrow Wilson's proposal that the U.S. form a new League of Nations. And that debate, as we all know, ended with the non-interventionists winning the argument, which didn't actually have to occur. That wasn't predestined, but it was really on sort of on the knife's edge. But in the 20s and 30s, the non-interventionists are dominant in alliance with the nationalists, actually. There's a strong nationalist component as well as a non-interventionist component to conservative and Republican foreign policy approaches in the 20s and 30s. And then, of course, in the 40s, you get this great debate, maybe the greatest of all time, where you have all three groups highlighted. And in the end, what happens is at the presidential level, at least, the conservative internationalists win the argument for a number of reasons having to do mostly with international events. The rise of the threat from Nazi Germany and Japan, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the results of World War II, and then the rise of a Soviet threat immediately after World War II. So those events together sort of pushed most conservatives and most Republicans in the more internationalist direction. They tended to win the presidential primaries in particular beginning in the 40s and then for decades. But it's worth noting that the pivot players in the middle, the conservative nationalists, were never really fully convinced of the benefits of a kind of liberal approach or a Wilsonian approach to foreign affairs. They were won over because they believed that there were specific threats, the Axis, the Soviet Union, communism, and so on, one after the other. So that's what tends to convince that middle group. And once the Soviet Union collapsed, then you have the question is up for grabs. What does it mean to be a conservative on foreign policy? And in the 90s, if you go back and you look at people like Pat Buchanan and Ron Paul, they were sort of on the margins, but they were indications that at least there was a debate beginning. But most Republicans, I think, were happy in the 90s with what had been achieved during the Cold War, and so there was no need to question the fundamental approach. George W. Bush succeeded, at least for a few years, in rallying most Republicans to his concept of a war on terror, the war in Iraq. But then frustrations over time brought that into question as well, especially once he left office. So I think one way to think about the Trump phenomenon is what Trump did in 2016 during the primaries was really unprecedented, at least since the 40s, which is he sort of turned on its head the dominant coalition going back to World War II. It had been the case that the conservative internationalists sort of ran the show with the support of conservative nationalists, and the non-interventionists were marginalized. And in the Republican primaries, I think Trump turned that upside down, tapping into dissatisfaction on a long list of issues, including foreign policy, but also trade, immigration, just a general discontent with establishment elites. So that was a surprise, but he did it. And then, of course, his presidency was more of a mix of all three, really, for a variety of reasons we can talk about if you like. But I think that now, with Trump having left the presidency, the debate is wide open as to what being a conservative means on foreign policy. I think we're living through one of those times where it really is up for grabs. And so that's why I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much. What do you think makes this particular moment in history? You just covered a range of different inflection points throughout our history. Is there anything that makes this particular moment different from the others? And what do you see as the various paths forward at this moment?
Sure. Well, there are some similarities. As I said, the basic similarity is that we have repeatedly seen that there are periods where conservatives debate fundamentals of foreign policy. So that actually shouldn't be so shocking. And we have a little bit of historical perspective. We can see we've been through this sort of thing before. The 40s are a good example. And actually, Senator Vandenberg is a leading example of that. We'll talk more about him in a minute, I'm sure. So there are some similarities with the past, but of course the specifics are different in the sense that, for example, in the 40s, the big picture story was the rise of America to world power, having followed a largely non-interventionist approach in relation to Europe, for example. I mean, Americans were now coming into a larger role. I think one of the differences today is that in the 1990s, the U.S. really seemed to be on top of the world. People talked about a unipolar moment, and there is a widespread feeling today that that's over. As powerful as the U.S. still is, I mean, at a minimum, you have to say China is a peer competitor, which it wasn't a quarter century ago. So, the trajectory is different in the sense that the international conditions are different, and of course, the exact, range of players on the domestic level is different as well.
Yeah, and how do you think the American public, you mentioned Senator Vandenberg, one of the purposes of the Vandenberg Coalition is to ensure that our foreign policy connects to the desires and wishes of the American people. And in your book, you touch on this quite a bit in Age of Iron. How do you think there are divergences, if at all, between the American public, and how do they play in between the American public and elites in Washington? Do you see those playing out? Are there misconceptions of conservative nationalism based on misperceptions of the American public? Could you expand on that a little bit too?
Yeah, you find in public opinion polling that at least traditionally during the Cold War and post-Cold War era, policy elites in both parties tended to be more supportive of intervention overseas, of free trade agreements, of sort of internationalist assumptions. The voters, there's more of a variety, not isolationist necessarily, but more skepticism, more ambivalence. That was true in both parties. And again, I think that's one of the things that Trump did in the primary, was sort of sense that there was that gap, and he obviously hit that gap, right? He spoke very openly about the skepticism about elite views on foreign policy in both parties, which is one of the things that made it different. So there has been a difference historically, and that in itself, that's actually nothing new. It tends to be policy elites in both parties that lead on foreign policy. And so as long as the public isn't terribly dissatisfied or feeling that it's paying an impossibly high cost, that has worked at times. And there's moments where the public really has rallied behind a more assertive approach, right after 9/11. when you saw clear evidence that solid majority in both parties was ready, for example, to attack the Taliban in Afghanistan, right? So there are those moments, but the general popular ambivalence about foreign policy isn't really anything new. The other side of it, though, I'd say, is that some people were so shocked by the spectacle of Trump as the nominee and then as the president that they misread the condition of conservative or Republican public opinion today and in the last few years. In other words, there hasn't actually been as much of a change as people think. If you look at Republicans and conservatives, according to Gallup, Chicago Council, Pew Research Center, the basic pattern for the past decade has been more or less continuous, which is your average Republican voter doesn't think very much of Vladimir Putin. He tends to have cool feelings or unfriendly feelings towards Putin, has mixed feelings about globalization, understands there are some benefits, but also feels there are certain costs, which, by the way, is true of the public as a whole. On balance, supports key alliances like NATO, actually. Your average Trump supporter, in fact, from the 2016 primary said they supported NATO. Some people are surprised to learn that, but it's true. And you just go down the list, right? There's more of an underlying awareness that the U.S. is going to need to play some continued international role, even though there's often a feeling of ambivalence about it. So that actually hasn't changed that much over time.
Yeah, thank you. I want to remind our audience members that they can submit questions to the chat at any time. We will open towards the end of the discussion to questions, but you can feel free to send written questions into the chat and we will collect those for the Q&A session. So Colin, this is a good time, I think, to ask you how you would distinguish liberal foreign policy from conservative foreign policy, because one of the motivations of this series was that when we think of domestic policy, it's easy to distinguish between a domestic agenda, a democratic agenda, and a Republican agenda, a liberal agenda, and a conservative agenda. But when we think of foreign policy, increasingly, sometimes it's hard to define what a conservative foreign policy is. And again, Age of Iron gets into this in great detail. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on what the differences are. Small government conservatives perhaps are also more skeptical of the United Nations, global governance. Could you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, I think what you get over time is liberals, of course, argue amongst themselves too, just like conservatives do what they believe. I mean, one of the most striking patterns on the left is sort of hawks versus doves. You sometimes get a very dovish approach among liberals, deep skepticism toward U.S. military role internationally. But there's also moments where liberals rally behind U.S. military intervention overseas, although they tend to want to support it for liberal reasons, right? Support of some liberal goals. But that hawk versus dove tension is always there on the left, just as it has been actually on the right. So that in itself isn't the main distinction. It seems to me the main distinction is that conservatives of all kinds tend to be more protective of U.S. sovereignty than liberals. In other words, liberals as a whole, whether they're liberal hawks or liberal doves, really do believe, I think, that the U.S. should cede a greater degree of sovereignty to multilateral organizations, and that there's a great deal to be gained by this more multilateralist approach. Multilateral across the board, almost a kind of religious faith that if you just sign up for enough treaties, organizations, and multilateral agreements, that will encourage world peace. And I just think conservatives of all kinds have tended to be more skeptical of that, whether they favor a strong U.S. military and an active role overseas, or whether they don't.
Yeah. So let's get into Age of Iron a little bit and talk about your fantastic book project. Could you tell us a little bit about the impetus behind the book? What was the motivation for writing this history on conservative nationalism in the role today?
Well, the impetus really was that, my feeling after the November 2016 election was whatever concerns people had about Trump, and I had some of my own, it was just time to kind of calm down and just try to be fair, give it a chance, recognize that he won a U.S. presidential election, and that let's see what he does, right? Try to be constructive. And I was struck how many people kind of went in the opposite direction. You just had a kind of almost hysterical reaction that never ended, and it just continued to ramp up in the months and years after November 2016. And so in particular, I was struck that there was not really out there a book that tried to analyze what Trump seemed to be doing in terms of his foreign policy in a reasonably objective way. And so I decided to write one. I mean, it's just that simple. I wanted to try to capture what, according to my understanding of the history of the party, where did Trump fit into that, knowingly or unknowingly? But I think he does fit into that, and he did fit into that in the sense that he tapped into this older American nationalist tradition, and then he had his own particular approach going back decades. Actually, he made it very clear how he felt. Going back to the 1980s, he said he thought that U.S. allies were free riding off of American largesse. So he was very clear on that, and he acted on it. But it wasn't exactly isolationist, and so that was why it was important to clarify what he was up to, and that was the impetus behind the book.
And you have spoken previously that you faced some criticism for writing the book. When you would go and give talks, you sometimes faced a lot of pushback. Because part of the purpose of this series is to have a space for civil dialogue, it'd be great if you could talk a little bit more about that and how you would address critics who said, perhaps we shouldn't even study this topic. Maybe they were critics of President Trump and they didn't think that an intellectual study of conservative nationalism was worthy of your attention. And what would you say to those critics?
Well, yeah, since it's a family show, I'll try to be look, so there's two levels to this. One is I found that, to be fair, there were a lot of people who really were open to the argument, whatever their politics. There were plenty of people who were willing to have a discussion, do panels, like this one, where they tried to take seriously the argument. But there was a certain type of reaction that was a little bit baffling to me, which was that just as soon as you mentioned the word Trump, conversation was over. And you could not have a calm, scholarly, objective conversation about what U.S. foreign policy looked like in that administration. And it was 4 years ago. I don't have to tell you, I mean, you probably were aware of this on the inside, but it was really something to see. So as far as your point about civil discourse, I am personally struck the last few years, the quality of debate, the quality of public discourse has gone down. But I do think the one thing that liberals, you asked me to sort of comment on the liberal side. I mean, a book that came out a few years ago by Madeleine Albright was called Fascism. And in that book, she did two things. She called for increased civility, and she also said that the U.S. was under an imminent fascist threat. Now, I mean, you can do one or you can do the other, but you can't do both. And I think we've really seen 5 years now, if not more. And again, there's honorable exceptions. There are serious liberals and Democrats who don't do this, right? We can name a few if you want, but there's also plenty, including online, and events like this, that just, on the one hand, want to say, let's have more civility. And on the other hand, literally want to spend 4 years saying that half the country basically resembles Nazi Germany. I mean, I'm not making this up. This is what they say. This is what they say every day. So it gets to be a bit much. And what I would say is, it's not so much about my book. That's not important. But the problem we're facing is they can't have it both ways. Either you really act on the call for civility that you're making, or you don't. And if you're going to spend year after year accusing people of being fascists, you're not going to have a civil discussion. It's just that simple.
Yeah. Do you think some of the pushback came from the word nationalism? This is something we've talked about, you and I, before, Colin, that there's an inherent reaction with that word. People maybe think of Nazi Germany when they hear the word nationalism. Is it different from populism? And can you expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So for me, nationalism, so specifically in terms of the Republican Party and its foreign policy, I think it has to do with this robust emphasis on U.S. sovereignty that I mentioned. More generally, I think in the United States, going back to the founding, there is a kind of civic nationalism, right back to the beginning, that emphasizes that this is a federal constitutional republic, and it's a free country, and it's an independent country, and our identity as Americans has to do with a strong sense of patriotism bound up with that nation state, right? So you're looking to protect a particular country, a particular way of life, and a particular set of small R Republican institutions. So that's American nationalism, which I think is mostly benign. tell you the truth. So when you get intellectuals or activists who say nationalism in the abstract is terrible, it's insidious, it's aggressive, I don't agree with that. I think, you know, you have to distinguish between what is American nationalism, including on foreign policy, by the way, and then, you know, let's say Venezuelan nationalism or Russian nationalism. They're not all the same. We need to be able to make that distinction. But at the general, you know, abstract level, there is a Western, there is a tradition in the Western world of belief that you can only have constitutional experiments in self-government within an independent nation state. It's an honorable tradition. This is not an insidious tradition. It's actually a positive one. And by the way, speaking of the Axis, we wouldn't have defeated the Axis without it. You needed to have a robust sense of British nationalism or American nationalism to defeat Hitler, right?
Yeah, so this also gets into the other term that evokes a visceral reaction in these conversations, which is, you know, the rules-based international order or the liberal world order, another term that comes up quite a bit in think tank discussions. Policymakers use it all the time. I think this administration has used it quite a bit. Some people think it's maybe too vague, or perhaps it represents some kind of imperialist attempt to undermine national sovereignty. How does that debate fit into the ideas that you looked into in this national sovereignty issue as well?
Well, there is a set of commitments that the U.S. took up in the 40s that I think really did make the world a safer place, a freer place. You know, core alliances and core agreements and understandings, diplomatic, economic, military, beginning in the 40s and then for generations. So often when people talk about the liberal international order, that's kind of the heart of what they're talking about. That's fine. But there's several problems. One problem is, since the end of the Cold War, it's been redefined, I think. And it's been redefined, for example, especially in the most recent years, to include what is really a kind of specifically left of center set of domestic policy preferences. So often now when you hear about liberal international order, you see very easily smuggled into that basically domestic policy preferences that are liberal or progressive, which wouldn't have necessarily been true in previous generations. So that naturally raises the question of why conservatives would want to go along with this. That's one problem. Another is that I think the post-Cold War era, and this is one of the things that Trump really did, I think, intuit, was that there was a sense of accumulated frustration over a kind of post-Cold War quarter century where not everything went as planned, to say the least, right? And we had interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan that were very frustrating in a lot of ways. You had a set of free trade agreements that fed into the perception in some circles that, you know, these patterns of globalization had not benefited working class Americans as much as wealthier Americans. And that, by the way, was one of his arguments in the primary that also had unexpected punch, right? So whether it was the military side, the economic side, concerns about sovereignty, you know, the concerns about the rise of China, I think he sort of hit on a number of realities that, however they were unpleasant, were real. You know, the supposed rules-based liberal international order by 2016 looked to be weaker or less appealing than a lot of people thought. And I'm not sure that liberals have got the message yet. I think that for all the talk about trying to learn from the Trump era, I think that with Biden, a lot of what you're getting is still kind of trying to cobble back together something like Obama, something like the set of assumptions that animated the Obama administration on foreign policy. And I think as long as liberal internationalists are unwilling to really internalize some of these criticisms, I think they're going to keep facing the same problems going forward.
Yeah, before we open to Q&A from the audience, how do these debates fall between conservative nationalists and conservative internationalists? Are you seeing fault lines on the conservative side between these two groups, or do these groups perhaps have more in common than maybe they would concede to each other? Where specifically do those groups diverge, if at all?
Right, so it's varied historically quite a bit. So I mentioned, for example, that you know, in the 40s you had these dramatic dramatic debates between somebody like a Robert Taft from Ohio, right? And then and he was opposing U.S. entry into World War II, and then somebody like Wendell Willkie right on the other. And then those debates just kind of kept rolling. Although most of the thing to keep in mind is that most American nationalists were able to rally around the war effort after Pearl Harbor. I mean, to say the least. So that's one of the typical qualities of that nationalist tradition, is that once the U.S. is really threatened or attacked or insulted or in combat, that they are often pretty relentless. So I think the Cold War was also a period where, even though a lot of nationalists were more anti-communist than anything else, for that exact reason, they were able to support a range of U.S. commitments. It wasn't so much about liberal internationalist order; it was about combating communism. So you get alliances at times. I mean, I think some leaders, Reagan, for example, and Nixon, were able to cobble together very effective alliances. I mean that both on the merits of the policies, but also politically, between conservative nationalists on the one hand, conservative internationalists on the other. And actually, George W. Bush had the support of a lot of conservative nationalists for those years that he was in office as well, right? Let's not forget that. Where it really breaks down, when Republicans are out of power, then it's a jump ball in basketball terms, and then you're back to a period where all the options are out there, as they were in let's say the 40s or the 90s, right, or under the Obama administration. And that's what we saw eventually with Trump, was that he cobbled it back together in a new way. I think in the end, one of the things that made Trump in office different from Trump in the primary was that there was enough in there for most Republican foreign policy hawks to like. If you notice, he actually had a lot of support from the whole range of foreign policy types in the party. That, Rand Paul found something to like, Lindsey Graham found something to like. He had that broad support. But now, if you ask Lindsey Graham and Rand Paul to sit down and have a discussion, there's probably not a whole lot they would agree on.
Do you think China today, the threat from China, may serve a similar purpose in terms of uniting conservative nationalists, conservative internationalists, and perhaps also allies on the more liberal side? With COVID, it's brought, I think, the China threat home to the American people in new ways. And do you see that serving a uniting purpose as we once again are in this jump ball scenario?
I do. I actually think China, the one issue that has more potential than the other to unite a broad majority of conservatives and Republicans on foreign policy issues is China. And you see that. Even some of the people who are the most skeptical, in retrospect, for example, George W. Bush and Iraq and the freedom agenda in the Middle East, are much more willing to support hardline policies on China. Now, there is an interesting debate going on right now about what exactly the U.S. should do in response to a contingency over Taiwan, for example. But I think you're going to find a critical mass of conservatives and Republicans out there who, whatever doubts they might have in certain other areas, they are going to favor a tough line on China.
Great. So now we have a number of questions coming in from our audience. So I'm going to ask a few of those. One question that you've touched on a bit is this issue of leadership. So an audience member has asked if part of the problem today is the lack of charismatic, persuasive leaders like Senator Vandenberg, for instance, or Ronald Reagan, who can perhaps explain foreign policy to the American people in a more accurate way. And do you see a difference between what people are calling isolationism and conservative nationalism? Are there misperceptions in conflating those two? And do we need better leadership?
Well, yeah, I mean, better leadership is always welcome. I think in terms of nationalism, as I mentioned, there is a difference between, I think, the nationalist tradition and the isolationist one, in the sense that, think of it this way, I mean, I'm looking at my window now, and this is a Virginia county that's kind of red state Republican, and I see a lot of trucks driving around with the Gadsden flag, the snake on the back, don't tread on me. That's closer to that conservative nationalist tradition, which is, there is a potential of counterpunch, of hitting back, of actually being pretty assertive in response to perceived threats to U.S. interests. And that's not what you call isolationist. So I think that the nationalist tradition has that potential to be very robust when it comes to support for the U.S. military, including support for the U.S. military overseas. And you've seen that over the years, right? So that snake on that flag can go in either direction. There can be a kind of reluctance to intervene, but there can also be a real kind of muscularity to it. So that's not isolationist. As far as leadership, we'll see how things play out. I do think a lot depends on who's president and who the nominee is. I think you find that every 4 years. That keep in mind, most voters are not voting primarily on foreign policy, right? So people may have strong views on foreign policy. From time to time, they may say, I feel strongly about this to vote on it. But for the most part, it's domestic issues and a sense of identity, domestic conditions. That in a way is good news because it allows room for leadership if individuals want to, right? As long as they don't offend kind of core principles or core beliefs on the part of their constituents. But one pattern I've seen for years is whoever is the president who's Republican is going to have majority support from Republican voters. That's just how it is. And people have had a hard time getting their head around that, but it's the truth. And actually, I would say it's probably true on the Democratic Party side as well. Most Democrats support Biden's foreign policy, even though you find that there's a wide variety of difference among liberal Democrats over foreign policy issues when you phrase it on an issue basis. But if you say to Democrats, do you or do you not support Biden's foreign policy, they'll say, yes, we do. Mm-hmm. So the pattern in American politics for a long time has been when a leader from your preferred party is president, you're going to tend to defer to them, all things being equal, on foreign policy, unless you just really disagree with some specific action they're taking.
So this answer actually touches on another question from an audience member who was asking about whether the direction of conservative foreign policy will be dictated more so by leadership in the Republican Party, demographics in the Republican Party, or sort of the Republican voter. What is the role of former President Trump in shaping the future of the party? Is there anything you want to add on that question before we move on to another? Yeah.
So we've mentioned that leadership can make a big difference. It's very important. But there's other factors as well. And I think one factor you have to consider is, as your questioner just asked, demographics, the base of the party. There was a time when the dominant sort of demographic in the party was basically, let's say, Northern Protestant, upper middle income professionals, right? Now we've shifted to a party that's more working class, actually multiracial, but predominantly white. So if you're talking about a party that is heavily dependent on white working class voters nationwide, especially in the South, in the Midwest, interior West, that's a party that's going to look a little bit different from, let's say, the party of, the 1950s. It's a party that's moved in a different direction. It's more culturally conservative. It's going to be more populist. And I think that's a reality that Trump recognized, whether intentionally or unintentionally, tapped into it, kind of accelerated a little bit, but it predates him. And so I think for that reason, it's going to outlast him. I think whatever happens with Trump, one way or the other, we've moved in the direction of a party that is more culturally conservative, more working class, more explicitly nationalist. And so I imagine a post-Trump, Republican Party, which one day will happen, is going to continue to have some of those features.
And would you, in describing us as being a more nationalist country, would you distinguish that from a populist country? That was one of the other questions we had come in from the audience. Are we really a nationalist country in the United States, or are we populist? So could you address that?
There can be overlapping qualities there, but they're also distinct. So I would just define populism. I define it in the book as just opposition to established elites, and that can be anywhere on the spectrum, left, right, or center. So, for example, William Jennings Bryan in 1896 is the classic populist, right? His issue was free silver, so he's speaking up for Western farmers, right? In that election, actually, Bryan is a populist, and William McKinley is a nationalist. So they're on opposite sides. But we've become used to thinking in recent years that they are the same. They're really not, but they can overlap. And I do think Trump especially tapped into an instinctive populist as well as an instinctive nationalist tendency sort of right and center right.
Great, and I remind audience members they can continue to submit their questions to the chat. We're going through them right now. Another question that came from the audience concerns how we, I guess as part of now the conservative foreign policy establishment, how do we better communicate with the public about more effectively about the risks from China and Russia, drawing necessary distinctions between those respective risks?
Well, I think there's a lot out there already. I think that there's plenty of people who are drawing attention to that and doing so effectively. There's been a lot of talk about the challenge from China, and there's really almost a cottage industry of terrific books out there just the last couple of years. So it's not for lack of, it's not so much for lack of conversation. I think that the public will sort of make up its own mind in its own way. I mean, this is something we've seen over the years. The best leaders tend to understand that, Lincoln, for example, right? My favorite Republican president. The way that effective presidents work with public opinion is to understand, on the one hand, yes, your role is to lead and to sort of nudge forward and speak out effectively. But that's not your only role. You have to sort of do a reality check to understand where the public is at. You have to start at where they are and then work from there. So Lincoln didn't come in, for example, Lincoln didn't come in 1860 or 61 saying, let's abolish slavery. Mm-hmm. You can make the moral case that he should have, but he didn't. His focus was actually more modest than that, and it was a very powerful focus to prevent the spread of slavery and then to preserve the Union. And then over time, he nudges in the direction that he may have wanted all along. So that's what effective leaders do. It's a two-way street between presidents and public opinion. I think the best presidents, a Reagan, a Lincoln, an FDR, they understand that public opinion is a reality, that there are certain limits or constraints it puts on you. They respect those limits, to tell you the truth. They don't try to blow past them. That's important, I think, for those in think tanks to respect and understand. But at the same time, they speak out on behalf of their beliefs, what they think is right. They try to nudge the public in the right way. That's what the best presidents do.
Okay, a few more questions. One that kind of picks up on your comments just now. We wonder whether the Biden administration's approach over the past year, we're now coming up to the year mark, has maybe changed perceptions of conservative nationalism. Has it altered people's perceptions at all? Could you touch on that a bit?
I don't think it's necessarily altered people's views on conservative nationalism. I don't think that most voters would think of it in those terms. So the point of the book is to try to understand patterns, but not to claim that this is how, I'm not claiming that most voters get up in the morning and say, yeah, I'm a conservative nationalist or a liberal internationalist or any of these things. What I do think the Biden team has managed to accomplish unintentionally is, in particular, the Afghanistan withdrawal was such a fiasco that it undermined confidence in the competence of President Biden. And if you can recall, his whole platform was, I'm going to restore kind of calm, sane competence to U.S. foreign policy, right? America's back, he said. Well, what happened last summer was kind of a debacle. And not only that, it was clearly not the case that America was back. It was, on the contrary, America was leaving in a really humiliating way. So that was, I think, a real moment of undermining a basic argument that the administration had made in a way that everybody can understand. Anybody, whatever their politics, could turn on CNN that week and hear some pretty withering commentary as to what was happening. So, and it's not a coincidence that his popularity, including on foreign policy, sort of dropped at that time and has never fully recovered. So I think that this, put it this way, it's made an alternative more plausible in the sense that Biden's foreign policy is not terribly popular. If you look at public approval ratings, it's not as though a majority of the public thinks he's doing a good job on policy. So then what's the alternative? Well, it's going to be whatever the Republicans offer.
Yeah, and to close out here, perhaps the last question, I can combine several that we've gotten from the audience that I would categorize as being about different isms. So we have a question about what is the difference between a restrainer or the ideology of restraint and conservative nationalism? Where are those fault lines? But we also have this question about conservative nationalism and Walter Russell Mead's conception of Jacksonianism. So just to, I guess, close this out today, could you describe the differences between those different categories? In Afghanistan, this came up a bit with the restrainers argument, and it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that.
Right, and the way I've always tried to approach this, and I've written a number of books and articles about it, is try to be empirical rather than theological, let's say. I mean, in other words, I'm interested in what American conservatives who call themselves conservatives actually say and think of foreign policy. I'm less interested in trying to take a single doctrinal starting point and then, fit everybody into, what is it, square pegs into round holes or something like that. So I don't think that's necessarily terribly useful. I think we're trying to identify broad tendencies, and that's what I try to do in the book. Now, as far as the restraint school, I think, somebody like a Barry Posen, who basically coined the term in his book, argues for clearly a much more detached approach overseas. It's not only a criticism of interventions in the past, it's the argument that we should be much less militarily engaged in particular. So in its pure form, and there's some variety on this, but some of the people who call for offshore balancing or restraint basically want to dismantle existing U.S. alliances, especially in Europe and the Middle East. Although over the years, some of them have said that they're more open to maintaining those alliances in East Asia because they're actually recognizing what a big challenge China really is. So that would still involve much scaling back beyond anything Biden has done or that Trump did in terms of the U.S. forward presence militarily. The non-interventionists on that wing of the Republican Party, somebody like a Rand Paul, I would say, appear to be sympathetic to that. That's how they've talked for years. So that was the question on restraint. And just remind me the other part of that question.
So we had a few questions about the difference between Jacksonianism and conservative nationalism, and also as you addressed the restraint school versus conservative nationalism.
Yeah, and I think Walter Russell Mead did a good job with the term Jacksonian of something that captured people's attention, which is quite accurate, which is that heartland conservative constituency I'm talking about that I describe as conservative nationalists. The point I would make there is that among conservative internationalists, there's actually a wide variety, and this is something that's not always understood. In other words, there's people who are more realists, there's people who are more idealists. There's people that are kind of in the Nixon-Kissinger tradition, there's people that are more in the Reagan-Bush tradition. W. Bush. So that conservative internationalist tradition is actually very broad. And to me, the only common theme is conservatives on domestic issues who then favor a forward role for the United States overseas, a wide range of commitments and institutions and agreements overseas. So, but yeah, I think if you wanted to put it in Mead's terms, the Jeffersonian maps onto the non-interventionist. But then on the other side, the kind of Hamiltonian and Wilsonians battle it out, right? Why are we engaged overseas? Is it mainly U.S. interests or is it liberal values? That's a debate that recurs as well.
Yeah, and is there anything that we didn't ask you today that you wish we had asked, either from us or the audience, any other subject that you wish we had touched on today before we close?
Well, I'll just say, just to loop back to the title of the conversation, Future for Conservative Foreign Policy, I think that it really is kind of on a knife's edge. What Trump did in the end was to knock open questions, first order questions that really hadn't been posed or answered before. And everybody has their own opinion about how he answered them or how he acted on that. But we are now asking first order questions, right? Why do we have alliances overseas? Why do we have bases? Why do we have trade agreements? I find this in class as well when I teach these subjects, especially among younger students. These are first order questions that are being asked, and it's not obvious what the right answer should be to these students. And I have a feeling it's the same with the general public because, it's been a long time now since the end of the Cold War, never mind the beginning of the Cold War. So if people who favor a forward presence overseas can't answer those questions satisfactorily, we're going to have a problem. That's what gets back to the heart, I think, of a group like Vandenberg is that, you know, there's got to be a connection with the general public to actually, in a persuasive way, say why this matters to people's ordinary lives.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, Colin, and thank you to our audience members for joining us for our first session of the series on the future of conservative foreign policy. We have a number of upcoming sessions. We appreciate everyone's patience at the start of the session today as we work through some technical difficulties in the COVID era, so we do appreciate that. It was such a pleasure to have Colin here with us today. His book, Age of Iron, is really a fantastic read if you're interested in learning more about the history of conservative foreign policy, and also in particular the history of conservative nationalism and how President Trump's approach abroad fit into the historical tradition of conservative foreign policy. Next week on Thursday, January 27th, we will have Dr. Will Inboden, who will also be discussing some of the history of conservative foreign policy with a particular focus on President Reagan's approach. He's in the midst of a book project on that subject. So Colin, thank you so much for being here today. And we want to thank our audience members as well for joining us. And we hope you'll continue to join us throughout the series. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, good.